Hi there, I'm JW the DM, and I am now part of the GM Philosophy channel. It's great to be here. Please check out all of the creators on this channel, join the Discord linked below, and help make our community the premier place to go for GMs to get help, advice, and support. Today, we're going to talk about what to do with PCs when their player has to leave the game or decides they want to play a new character. The short version, and I hope you stay for the long version, is that you, the GM, should do your best to work with the player to give that character a memorable send-off, most of the time. As I mentioned, sometimes a player just wants to try out a new character. It happens. Believe it or not, players can get bored of a character. But from time to time, you'll have to deal with the occasional player having to leave, and that's not a bad thing. It happens to every GM. Players leave for many reasons, especially weekday, daytime, working hours virtual games like mine. A new job, a new position, a shift of schedule, moving, a loss of home, etc. are just some of the legitimate reasons someone is leaving the game. Of course, sometimes these are just excuses for a player to leave who isn't comfortable telling you why they're actually leaving, but that's a topic for another day. Today, the point is that players do leave games for legitimate reasons. Since my main game is a weekday, daytime virtual game, changes in someone's job situation or class schedule is always hovering over our heads. Every now and then, longtime player has to leave. But that isn't the end of the world. Sometimes it's a great opportunity to create some epic gaming moments. And while we're here, let me remind you that during Session 0 and during onboarding for players coming later into the game, drive home the point that A, if a player knows they need or want to leave the game, to give you as much notice as possible, B, to provide you with constructive feedback for good or ill, and C, to work with you on resolving their character's story, if possible. From my experience of having great players leave, they usually have advance notice of the change and can still fit in a session or two of playing, if you're playing a weekly or bi-weekly game. The time between you being informed of the impending departure and when it actually happens is going to be time well spent. By the way, I've also got ways to handle characters left over from a player being kicked from a game. That all depends on the circumstances and the personality of the player involved. I'll get to that. Stay tuned to the end. For now, though, I'm focusing on what to do when great long-term players have to go. When a player informs you of their intent or need to leave, present them with a couple of options for their character. Depending on the direction the player and I think the party is going to go in the next couple sessions, there may be more or less options available, but generally you've got these two: the Ride into the Sunset and the Blaze of Glory. Let me just say right now that my favorite is the Blaze of Glory. All right, let's break these down. The Ride into the Sunset. This usually isn't the most epic of the two options, but for some players it gives them the most closure. Sometimes it's also a great way for removing a character in a way that keeps them alive in the game, even though they're not there. An option that's good if you and the player believe there's a good chance they can return to the game. That's happening right now. I've got a player who's been gone who's returning to the game in about a week. This might be things like deciding to go into retirement, learning about some long-term family issues that need to be dealt with that will probably be ongoing, or being given a title or position that will require the character to leave the party and stay in one place indefinitely. I used this almost a year ago for one player who wasn't leaving the game but wanted to play a new character, and the old character still keeps in touch with the party. Now, one very strong use of the Ride into the Sunset is the individual quest, and this is the one that I'm using right now for the player who's about to return. Somehow, whether through receiving a letter, a sign from their deity, a last-minute prophecy, or simply needing to pursue a personal nemesis, the character learns about a quest that they believe they have to go on, starting immediately, that only they can handle. The reasons only they can handle it are numerous, but the one I like is a combination of a future fight that needs to be mano a mano combined with needing the rest of the party to continue trying to save the world in the main storyline. There's a time limit for saving the world, and the character can't risk that the party gets sidetracked from their main mission just to go off and help this character with their individual quest. This makes for some great roleplay moments, from the time of the character learning of the quest, and then telling the rest of the party that they're leaving, and making preparations for leaving, and then saying goodbyes, which usually leads to actual goodbyes being said to the players. It makes for some awesome moments and leaves you wondering if the character will fulfill their quest, and knowing about the epicness that the character is heading off on a grand adventure. And then there's the Blaze of Glory. When it's pretty obvious that there's no chance that a character will return and the game's circumstances will allow it, this is the one I urge my players to embrace, and so far it's been embraced with gusto. You can guess what this is without me giving you a long descriptive speech. It's getting the party into a situation where that character is going to sacrifice their life to save the rest of the party. This one requires a little railroading and getting a little extra meta with the other players, but the results are totally worth it. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of other options out there for helping a character say goodbye, and if you think of 1, 2, or 17, put them in the comments so we can all benefit. Once the player and the party's circumstances have determined which option is going to be used, it's time to craft the story. No matter how you cut it, there's going to be some amount of railroading and a corresponding amount of metagaming. The ride into the sunset really only depends on some light railroading and metagaming for the players in question, although there's some metagaming on the part of the other players too. The Blaze of Glory, however, is very much a railroad because you need to get the PCs into a certain scenario that you've concocted with the player. It's no more meta really than the ride into the sunset, except that the other players need to be warned to let the character in question do something to save the day and let their characters get into the situation from which they need to be saved. Here's an example from a couple of years ago of crafting the story for A Blaze of Glory. A really great player who I know really liked my game had a job change with new hours and a much higher position and pay, so good for him. Because of the 2-week notice for his work, he was able to tell me a couple weeks in advance, and we immediately got to work. His backstory had him on the run from 3 different groups of bad guys because he was a swashbuckling rogue who had a smuggling job go south. Basically, his smuggling partner stole all the goods, all but one important one, and then sold them out to the City Watch. Of course, the supplier and the buyer were now after him as well. Now, the party was staying at an inn, and it was generally known that they were there, and they were, as adventurers are, pretty conspicuous. Anyway, remember that one important item? It was a bottle with a map blown into the glass. The buyer didn't care about the rest of the goods so much as the bottle, so he teamed up with the backstabbing smuggler, hired a whole bunch of mercenaries, brought his pet assassin, and they simply just set themselves up to capture the party in the main room of the inn in the tavern. And before you ask, nobody had a particularly high passive perception, although that really wouldn't have made a difference. Railroading, right? The players knew that something from that character's past was going to happen and to let a situation put them in jeopardy, whatever that situation was going to be. The player and I had spent the 2 weeks working together, no DM-specific secrets being withheld, crafting this scenario. The bad guys would surround the characters in overwhelming numbers. The PCs were relatively low level, and then they'd threaten our hero with the lives of the rest of the party. And then came the execution. When the game was actually being played and the time came for the trap to be sprung, the party didn't even need to follow a script because the overwhelming numbers were already there to subdue them. The bad guy made his demands. The hero managed to swap bottles and give the real one to the party wizard, who hid it in his robes. Then, after some back and forth with the bad guys, the hero impaled the backstabber, who turned out to be his identical twin. Now, I can't exactly remember what happened next, but here's my headcanon. The hero managed to get behind the main bad guy, who was only a commoner stat-wise, and put his rapier to his throat, getting the baddie to have his mercenaries putting down their weapons. Now at this point, I think the assassin then got behind our hero and put her knife to his throat. So 3 people in a line with 2 holding a blade to the throat of the person in front of them. There was a pair of quick throat slitting where both the bad guy and our hero died. Having their source of funds gone, the mercenaries didn't bother following up and killing everybody, so they just took off, and the assassin took the fake bottle and also just took off. Not only did the character go out saving his friends' lives, but he also left them with a pretty compelling quest hook, keeping his memory in the game. Cool, no? I hope that this inspires you when you next have a player exit, although I also hope that that's a rare occurrence. Now, I promised you something about characters left when a player is booted from the game. I've generally handled this in two ways. If the player was rather unpleasant to play with or be around, my in-game way of dealing with their character was to give them an ignominious death at the first chance. Ideally from doing something stupid like pulling a Leroy Johnson, and meaningless because it helps nobody. For the people who had the most trouble with that player, this provides some good closure. The second way is for players who were booted because they simply had a different play style and accepted the booting with grace and hopefully provided some useful feedback. And yes, I've had those. I've had several of them. I offer either the Ride into the Sunset or the Blaze of Glory, and to contact them and let them know how the session went. You'd be surprised how grateful people can be about giving their characters a nice send-off, even though the player has been asked to leave the group. Once again, for the rare instances where a player has to go, I hope that you found some inspiration in this video. If you did, hit the like and subscribe buttons and set that bell icon to all. And don't forget to tell us how you've handled characters of departing players in the comments below. You can also catch me on my own channel, JW the DM. Thanks for watching. May all your games be full of glory.